Lovely. Wonderful. Welcome to those that have joined us this morning. And hopefully you are here to talk about, we've had quite a few people join just now, so that's great. Okay, so I'm going to just start again. So welcome everybody to our workshop or our PD Day workshop today about understanding and supporting students with bereavement. My name's Dr. Emmeline Guaspari. I'm a principal clinical psychologist and I work across several teams, including the psychology in schools team. Do you want to introduce yourself, Zoe?
Yeah, hi, I'm Zoe. I'm an assistant psychologist in the psychology and schools team.
So welcome. So what we're hoping to do today is talk a bit about what is grief, what does it look like, tips for supporting young people, links for further support, and we'll have a Q&A, so that's a question and answer function at the end of the workshop for you as well. Now, what we want to start by saying is that this is a topic that can be really emotive to most people, not to all, but lots of people kind of connect with loss and bereavement in some way or another. So, what we'd like to say is be kind to yourself. If you need to sort of step out or have a minute, please kind of just take care of yourself along the way, really. So that's what we want to start by saying. What we'd like to ask you to make sure you do is just make sure your mics are turned off for the first part, so for the presenting part of the workshop. That would really help us out if that's okay. So, and what we're going to do today throughout the workshop is we're going to use an interactive function called Slido. And you can either join this by scanning your QR code on the phone, or you can join at slido.com and put the code into there. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do that. And it just really helps us out. The more people that sign up to Slido this morning, the better. We've got a really small group, and it just really helps us to interact with you for the beginning part today, if that's okay. Shall we go to the first Slido just to sort of see how people are getting on with that? Brilliant. So you can still see the QR code if you're struggling or you're still trying to work it out. So the first question is, how confident do you feel supporting a young person with bereavement? And I guess that's what we're here to talk about. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so a bit of a mixed picture, but not massively confident, but not sort of right at the bottom either. So that's really helpful for us. And should we move on to our first sort of next slide that you're going to do, Zoe, where we're kind of asking a bit of a question of what their understanding is.
Yeah, so just kind of what does grief mean to you?
I should say it is anonymous. It doesn't tell anybody what you've put because we didn't have that slide at the beginning, did we? And don't worry about getting it right or wrong. There is no right or wrong to this. So it just helps us get a bit of an understanding. Yeah, processing. You might have multiple thoughts about it as well. Great. They almost go nicely together there, don't they? So maybe something about processing, a bit about loss. Okay. Oh, somebody else typing. Okay,
Mm.
ending. Cool. Do you want to take us to the next slide, Zoe?
Yeah, thank you for sharing, everyone. So we're going to start a little bit with what is grief. So you've definitely started to capture that with some of the answers you've given already, which is great. So grief is sort of our natural emotional response to loss. When we experience a loss in our lives, we need to process that. And um, it's really important to capture that that's a really subjective experience. It's going to be different from one person to the next. One young person you work with may grieve totally differently to another young person. But grief is that experience, that natural emotional response to loss. So today we're going to highlight bereavement in particular. So how we respond to losing someone that we love and who we really care about. But it's really important to keep in mind that actually people experience grief to a number of things, and your young person may not have experienced a bereavement, but they may be grieving other losses. For example, maybe they've moved house, maybe they're having to move schools, or they've recently moved schools. Perhaps their parents are getting a divorce. Maybe someone's become unwell and the relationship they have has changed. They can't do the same things that they used to be able to do with a person anymore. Or maybe they've lost a friendship that was really important to them. So I think these are things to keep in mind. And some of these actually obviously tie in with the bereavement as well, which Emmy's going to speak about a little bit more later on, of sort of the ripple effect of loss. Um, but yeah, as I said, we're going to focus mostly on bereavement today, but it's important to highlight that the common misconception that grief has to be in response to a bereavement, that other factors can also create those feelings as well. Okay, so another Slido for you all. So what emotions do you think young people might be experiencing after they've experienced a bereavement? Sadness, definitely. Confusion, emptiness, anger, definitely. Yeah. Rejection, definitely. A lot of young people sometimes perceive things quite personally, so that's a really big one.
I think the other one to hold in mind is also a sense of numbness. Because
Yeah,
sometimes young people, well, all of us actually, can feel a sense of numbness to start with. And then you can have all of those different feelings potentially as well.
definitely.
I just think that might be worth holding in mind.
Yeah.
And that can be
Okay.
confusing to others, can't it?
Yeah, but it's kind of that shock, isn't it? You just sort of
Hmm.
feel almost nothing at times, and that can be quite confusing for yourself and sometimes for others. Okay, thank you everyone for sharing those. Okay, so we're now going to look at some theories around grief. These are tools that you can use really with young people um, to help them get an understanding of what they might be experiencing, but it's also helpful for us to understand what's going on for them as well. So we'll look at the tangled ball of grief. I think his name was Norman, right? I probably should have written that in there. Um, he came up with a really lovely graphic, which is just this tangled ball of all different feelings. And it captures that grief is really complex and it's experienced differently by everyone. Obviously, there's crossover and you know, there's common feelings that people might report, but this tangled ball sort of just highlights that you can feel lots of different things. And I suppose your tangled ball of grief can look different day to day. You know, one day you might feel really angry. The next day you might feel mentally sad. The next day you might feel nothing. Um, so it's just quite a nice graphic to capture that complexity. But many people report feeling sort of an immense sadness, anxiety, guilt, shock, tiredness. It's obviously quite exhausting having all these conflicting feelings and having to process them at the same time. It's going to make you feel quite tired. denial, and then also a sense of relief. Depending on the nature of loss, sometimes you do get those sorts of feelings, and that's totally normal and okay to feel that way. Sometimes those feelings of relief can then fuel those feelings of guilt when actually it's very normal to experience that, and reassuring young people that all of these emotions are totally normal and totally valid in a very complex process is really helpful. Then we've got the Stages of Grief model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You may be familiar with this. It's quite popular, and quite an old model. So this theory proposes that grief has stages. So it's a linear model. Grief is a process that you go through step by step. And the stages that Elizabeth proposed were denial initially. So you may be in shock, I can't believe this has happened. Then you might move on to anger. So you may be angry at the person who you've lost. You might be angry at the world, or it may just be a feeling and you're not really sure who you're angry at. You're just angry. Um, then bargaining, so sort of asking those questions. What if, you know, why has this happened? Then moving into a depression stage. Your mood is going to be extremely low. You'll be feeling fatigued. And then the final stage is acceptance. So coming to terms with the loss and accepting that it has happened. Um, this model can be quite helpful for people who like to view things in a linear way. So some young people might find it helpful to have like a step-by-step view of the process and kind of know what's going to happen for me now this has happened. Um, and, I think that can be helpful, but there are also challenges with this model. So having these stages, a challenge is that people may feel like there's a wrong way to grieve. If they don't fit into this pattern, then am I doing this right? Is there something wrong with me? You know, and that can be quite problematic. And it also kind of having that acceptance stage kind of applies a pressure to move on quickly. Um, you know, do
There's
I,
there's also that expectation that you'll get over it necessarily, which isn't the case for everybody, is there?
yeah,
So
definitely, definitely, it's kind of suggesting it's something you need to move on from. But in reality, which we'll look at in later models, it's an experience you are going to carry with you throughout your life. You don't need to move on from it. It's going to come with you. You're going to process it. So I think this model is helpful, but try and use it when you think a young person would really benefit from having things mapped out in a linear fashion. Um, some children who are neurodiverse may like things in a linear way. Um, so this could be helpful. But I think just be mindful and reassuring that you may not necessarily fit this pattern, and that's okay too. Then we've got the Whirlpool of Grief by Wilson. So this model kind of starts to combat some of those issues. So Wilson said that we're all going along the river of life in our little paddle boats, and in life there might be little waves, but we're just going along. And then when you experience a bereavement, it sends you plunging into this whirlpool. Now, if I fell into a whirlpool, I'd feel pretty shocked, pretty cold, pretty numb. It would be very extreme. And I suppose this model really highlights the upheaval that a bereavement can send you into. Um, so initially there'll be that shock, that numbness and denial as you fall down the waterfall of bereavement. And then as you're in the whirlpool, you're going to be kind of swished around and experiencing all sorts of different things. So as you can see on the picture, we've got loss and emotional disorganization or falling apart. It can just feel like every emotions are all over the place, everything's kind of falling apart. Also, the pain and physical symptoms if you were to be washed up onto the rocks. Bereavement can feel quite painful. We feel it in our chest. We feel that anxiety and that hurt emotionally. We may feel washed up or broken down, and things may become really disorganized and chaotic, and it's very challenging to manage. Um, I really like what it says along the bottom. Bereavement is what happens to you. Grief is what you feel, and mourning is what you do. So kind of as you begin to emerge, as the river continues to flow along, the river of life, we start to accept the reality of the absence that's happened and begin loving again and reorganizing the chaos into something that we can manage. This is really nice because it does again highlight that subjectivity of the grieving process. And some people might stay in the whirlpool for longer than others. Um, I think this also can help explain why some people might seem okay on the surface, but actually they may be struggling. Um, yeah, so I really like this model. And then we've got Tonkin. So Tonkin proposed the growing around grief model. So it's often assumed that grief is something that gets smaller over time. But in reality, it's not something we move on from. It's something that we take with us, and life continues to grow around it. Um, so this kind of breaks that stigma that you need to move on quickly because it's something that's going to be carried with you. A young person is always going to have that grief, that loss. Just over time, they're gaining new experiences and building new relationships that can make that grief seem less dominant in their life. So initially, when you experience a bereavement, that grief feels really big, because we've not got many other experiences around it at the moment. So, you know, at that time, things may feel really emotive. And as time goes on and we gain these new experiences, we still feel emotional about them. And so at different times, this grief can still feel really big. It's just we've got all of these new experiences around that grief that help us to cope and manage, um, which is, I think, a really lovely way of looking at grief. And I think this is a nice model you can use with young people. You could almost have, I know some people represent it as jars, and you have a ball in a jar, and then you have different sized jars, and the ball stays the same, but the jars get bigger. It's quite a nice way you can show young people um, the experience of grieving. And then we've just got a little video here, which we're going to play from 1 minute 40, if I
Bringing
can do
home
that,
to life
after
with the Cotswold
we
Company.
hear about the
Discover our
Cotswold
range at
Company
cotswoldco.com.
and
The future of your business
the
is
future
here.
of your business.
With Wix, you get advanced AI capabilities. For more,
Grief is a natural response to loss. Growing around grief. Grief is often thought of something that slowly gets smaller over time. But another way of looking at grief and recovery was suggested by Dr. Lois Tonkin. Grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it, leaving space in our lives to be filled alongside grief. We can still grieve the loss of someone or something that we loved, while growing a new life. Whirlpool of grief. Dr. Richard Wilson imagines the process of grieving as a journey taken along the everyday river of life. When we experience loss, our raft plunges down the steep waterfall of bereavement, which is a sudden shock and linked with feelings like numbness and denial. At the bottom of the waterfall, we find ourselves swept up into the whirlpool of grief, where our life is in turmoil, and we feel emotions like anger, guilt, or stress. We might escape the whirlpool and find ourselves washed up on the banks of the river, feeling stuck and unable to move forwards. Or we're thrown on the rocks at the edge of the whirlpool, where emotional pain hits us at unexpected times. Finally, we leave the whirlpool and join a new stream as we start to accept the loss and move towards loving again. We all experience this journey differently, and some of us may have sturdier boats than others with strong family support to help guide us. Did any of these analogies resonate with you? If so, which one was your favourite? Please let me know in the comments.
I think that was a really nice bit to add at the end, that to be mindful of the boat that young people are in as well, that some boats might be sturdier than others. Some young people might have loads and loads of support around them, whilst others don't. Um, and thinking about how you can help build that young person's boat to make it feel a bit more sturdy in a difficult time for them is really nice.
I also wonder whether sometimes there's a bit more of a kind of whirlwindy bit in the river or more of a ripple at times like anniversaries or birthdays. So times when maybe that kind of grief feels really strong again as well. And we can kind of sort of cycle back through that sometimes.
Definitely. Oh, it's not going to let me move forwards.
Grief is a
Oh, now too
There we
far
go.
forwards. There we
That's okay.
go. Okay, so sudden, unexpected, or traumatic loss. So it's important to keep in mind that the nature of a bereavement can also have an impact on the way that a loss is experienced. So, uh, for example, perhaps a young person has been expecting a loss. They know that this is going to happen. They've had these conversations with parents, family before this has happened. Um, that will have an impact on the way they process things. If a loss is sudden or unexpected or traumatic, the grieving process is often more intense. That's not necessarily the case, but it can be. So, if we look at bereavement by suicide, it's often described as grief with the volume turned up. So, the grieving process is often intensified for young people who suffer a bereavement by suicide. Common feelings can include feeling abandoned. So, a lot of young people might view things in quite a personal way. So, if they've lost someone to suicide, questions might be, it's all my fault, I'm not enough, why have they left me? Sort of those feelings of abandonment are quite common. Also feelings of guilt. So they may blame themselves for that experience, look for things in their life that they could have done differently. What, how did I make this happen? It's important in those situations to really reassure young people that it's normal to feel the way they're feeling, but of course it isn't their fault for what has happened. Obviously, shock, again, anger. So young people may feel angry at what has happened. Help is at Hand is a nice resource. It is linked there. It offers advice and guidance specifically for the experience of bereaving a suicide. Sometimes the support you get will need to be more specific to help a young person to process that experience.
Lovely. I think really important to hold on to sort of considering what the person meant to the young person as well. I think that's something we haven't talked about this morning, but I think just the meaning of the person, is it somebody really close, like a parent or a best friend, or is it somebody that they sort of knew in passing, or somebody where they were expecting a loss? But it's also kind of thinking about the circumstances like Zoe's just talked about, and that can be by suicide. but it can be that it was a really sudden death. It could have been a traumatic event. It could have been that, the person had been ill for a really long time. So it's understanding the circumstances and what the person meant to them. And were they present? Was it really difficult for them? So all of those different things might be really helpful to understand when you're supporting a young person with bereavement and with grief. So just to kind of, we've got a bit of a slide thinking about the different developmental stages and how kind of grief might be sort of impacting at those different developmental stages. So if we're looking at, obviously, I don't know what age group you're working with, but let's just go through them. So a 2 to 5 year old might show a little bit of regression, and that might be things like starting to suck their thumb or sort of doing bedwetting when they've maybe been dry at night already, and that kind of being really fearful of separation. And sort of at that age, sort of young people still tend to see death as a temporary kind of fixture and might be asking, when's mummy coming back? Or when's, so and so, what, where are they? Are they coming round for dinner? So they might kind of ask some really kind of random questions where you think, well, I've told them they're not coming back. So a 6 to 9 year old starts to become a bit fearful of death, and children are learning that death is more permanent. And I've seen this in my own children, sort of that change in how they see things, because we experienced quite a traumatic death when my daughter was 4 years old. And those questions, there was that fear of what's happening and what might happen to mummy, but not really that understanding that things are going to be permanent. So when they turn about sort of 10 to 12, and obviously there's going to be variations because of different sort of maturity levels, but as your typical 10 to 12-year-old might have a bit more of a realistic understanding of death, and they might start becoming a bit more preoccupied about it. They might be concerned about sort of practical questions, things like, will there be a change in the family? What happens? And they might ask you some really detailed questions that you'd probably rather they didn't ask you, in fairness, as a parent or as a family member or as a teacher, sometimes even. So, and then your 13 to 18-year-olds tend to sort of question their beliefs around death and may even want to avoid that topic. So my niece and nephew were in that sort of age category when they lost their mum unexpectedly. And, it's one of them quite liked to talk about it. The other one definitely didn't want to talk about it. And it's kind of sort of just working with where that person's at that different developmental stage, but also what their preferences are. And I guess teenagers particularly might have different preferences. And, they might do a lot of internal questioning about it, or might also express themselves more externally. But often there's a lot of that questioning process that happens. So, one of the things I want us to think about is that kind of ripple effect that can happen when there's a loss. So, because there can be really a lot to juggle for a young person that you might be working with. So, it might be that, they've lost a parent, for example, which is incredibly difficult. But let's just take the example of it was a single parent. Then what happens to this young person? They might have to move in with the other parent part that they don't get on so well with, or they don't know so well really because they're a bit more distant. Or they might have to go and live somewhere totally different. So it might be that actually that loss might kind of cause a ripple effect in terms of their surroundings, their physical surroundings, and or it might be that, they have to move. It might mean they have to also change schools. It might have an impact on family dynamics. Their role within the household might change. They might hold different responsibilities. And it can also lead them to feeling really different to their peers. So, so if you've got an adolescent who's lost somebody really close to them, they're going to be preoccupied with different things to your other teenagers in the classroom potentially. The other teenagers in the classroom might be moaning about their parent while this person's maybe lost their parent. So they can feel really sort of different and separate, or their kind of teen counterparts might feel really awkward kind of about mentioning the parent in front of this kind of person that's lost a parent, for example. I'm using the parent as an example. Obviously, it can be anybody, but it's just helpful to sort of think about what's the ripple effect and what's that kind of wider impact. And I've talked to lots of teens who talk about actually it's really changed their identity, how they look at themselves. And that can feel really hard when actually the main kind of point during adolescence is about connection with your peers. And if you feel really different to your peers, that's a real challenge because you just want to be belonging to that peer group particularly. You were looking for that kind of popularity, that sort of sense of I'm in that group really. And so that can feel really difficult. Now, the other thing to hold in mind is that if the death has been quite a traumatic one, actually our brain's going to be really wired about sort of threat and safety. So we might also be much more alert around other people and that sense something bad could happen. So the ripple effect of whatever's happened can be really a norm. But there can also be that sense of shame and guilt sometimes. So, if you felt you haven't been able to say something to the person you've lost, or you feel you didn't manage to do something the way you wanted to do that for the person before they died, then you can have this real sense of shame and guilt, or you can feel those emotions even by having a really nice experience one day and you feel, oh, I shouldn't have those experiences. So it's just thinking about not just the loss itself, but thinking about what else is happening for your young people that you're supporting in your schools. Has there been a massive change? Sometimes it can also mean separation from siblings because siblings have different parents. So, and I've seen that quite a few times where, the mum had all the children to care for, mum dies, and these children have had to deal with that change of home, but also being apart from each other, where that's maybe would have been a really helpful support mechanism for them. Okay, so here's a Slido question about how might learning and behavior change as a result of bereavement? That feels like a really big question, doesn't it? But what might you notice? What might you notice in terms of the young people in your classrooms, in terms of how they're acting or how they engage in their learning? And I appreciate that's a really big and broad question. And I'd love it if you could sort of have a think about that. Yeah, more withdrawn. Great. Yeah. Oh, great. May stop taking an interest. Yeah, struggle to focus, unable to focus, may start acting out. Absolutely. Or be more withdrawn. So kind of quite a variety there, isn't there? Which just shows how different it can be. A change in behavior. Yeah. Anything you want to say about that? Sort of particularly what you might see? So you could see quite a few different things, couldn't you? Just wait for that answer to come in. You can sometimes have somebody who's been like an A-star student, as they would call it in my day. That's probably not what you call it now, but really then struggling to engage in their schoolwork and really falling behind. So, and that might be about unable to focus, for example. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next slide. So, oh, we'll get the answer, whatever you've put in a bit. So don't worry. So if you still want to answer that, you're more than welcome to. So if we think about the impact of grief in schools, there's sort of three different components for us to think about. So there's the cognitive part, and you very beautifully already said, actually, it can become really hard to focus. So that's about difficulty concentrating, harder to remember information, and actually they might be cognitively, so in their minds, really preoccupied with their bereavement. They might be overthinking what's happened. So they might be so busy in their heads that it's really, really difficult to take on new information. They might also be thinking, what's the point, really? Because life is really awful right this minute. So it's not necessarily a conscious decision, though, to not be focused and not to be kind of concentrating. I guess this is just a natural impact that can happen because the mind is already really, really full for them. So, and what we know is if the mind's really full, actually, it's really hard to cram anything else into that, really. So the next bit is behavioral. So, and you've talked a bit about actually behavior can change in the young person. So it might mean that the person doesn't come to school as regularly. So they might be skiving a bit or, ditching school as they call it in my days, not completing tasks. So they might not be coming and bringing their schoolwork back, so you've set them homework and they're not bringing it back at all. They might be really distracted. They might be distracting other people in your classroom as well for that. Or they might be really tearful and they might burst into tears kind of regularly in your classes. So the presentation can be really different. There might also be, somebody said, acting out more. So, they might also be kind of sort of back chat and giving you lots of lip or kind of being a bit more aggressive in their kind of mannerisms. So there can be a significant change in behavior. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to do this, but this is just something that can happen. So, and then you've got the emotional part. So we talked about that earlier already, and Zoe did a lovely job talking about the different theories about the different emotions we can have. I mean, they might feel anger, they might feel sadness, they might feel low self-esteem or self-confidence, because actually they might have relied on the person who they've lost to boost them up in that way, because they were great at saying, you know what, Bob, you're doing really well, keep going, you can do this. But that person might not be there anymore. So that might have an emotional impact as well as a sort of behavioral and cognitive impact, therefore. Um, and there might be that sense of guilt. So you can kind of see that those three different areas can be impacted. They could all be impacted at the same time. Or it might be that some areas are more heightened than others at different times. So you might just have somebody who, on the surface looks like they're really losing control, they're acting out. And then, or you might have the person who's really sort of tearful and really struggling to kind of concentrate and showing you their emotions, whereas others might be kind of pretending they don't have any emotions about it and they're just going to be really focused and really concentrating and nothing's happened. So they might go through that denial at the same time and that pretense of nothing's happened because that's something that might be easier for them in front of you. So, what can we do to support our students? So, that's our next slide, please, Zoe. So, what can we actually do? So, now having spoken to a lot of young people, sort of checking in seems to be a really important aspect. And I guess I sort of think about this personally and think about actually when I've experienced losses. And I think this is really interesting when I sort of watch other people as well, is that we tend to sort of check in on the person for the first few weeks, maybe the first month or so. Everybody kind of rallies around you when you've had a loss and tells you how sad it is, and I'm here for you if you need anything. So that's great. We sort of have that authority, that kind of permission to do that at the beginning almost. But then that sort of trails off very quickly. But actually, it might be that this young person has sort of done that kind of numbing part that we talked about earlier, and then has that emotional tsunami a little bit further down the track. But also the support needs might change because they've had a lot of support for that first bit, but actually after that first month or two, that sort of trailed off and they still need a bit of support. So young people I've worked with often talk about, please just keep checking in. But don't assume that what I tell you is my support need the first time round will be the same as like a month down the line. So it's just helpful to check in whether the young person wants to talk about it, what they might need from you. Is there anything that can be done to help this person? Don't be afraid to have those conversations. And I guess young people often tell me as well, if you're going to be awkward about it, it makes me feel awkward to talk about it. So so think about speaking to the family, thinking about actually asking them how can you best support this young person? Maybe have a bereavement support pack to hand that you can send home. And so it's kind of making sure you communicate with the family because it could have been, they've lost a really close friend. It was a family friend, or, so think with the family, what can you do to help this young person best? So communication is really, really key. Um, and then also hold in mind the family's belief system. What we believe about loss and bereavement and, all of those things is really, really important. So cultural kind of aspects might be important. Do they have a set belief system that helps them in a certain way and where what you offer them in terms of support might be accepted or not accepted? So just kind of check in about belief system. Young people have their own belief system sometimes if it's not sort of culturally driven as well. So check in what that might be. I think it's important to think about letting the young person grieve at their own pace. Let's not expect them to be kind of back up and running after 2 weeks of losing somebody really close to them. They're all going to be different and they have different needs and they take different times to do certain things. And I guess it's sort of holding in mind that sort of balance of grieving and functioning, really. And, we can work really hard at sort of managing day-to-day life, but we also have to do that grieving part. So, and they can kind of work in tandem, but sometimes one might be more dominant than the other, and that's okay. So be mindful of what has happened and how this may impact the young person in school. So we've already talked about thinking about how did the person lose that person? Was it traumatic? Was it expected? Were they there? Were they not? So just being really mindful of that and then thinking what can be the impact. So has it had a big ripple effect? So just kind of hold that in mind when you're thinking about this young person. Obviously, as staff members, you can think about continued CPD, and there's a recommended link there for online bereavement training for schools by Winston's Wish, which is a free online resource on course on bereavement. So, if you want to know more and think about this some more, that's a great kind of resource. And then kind of think about facilitating peer support where that's appropriate. So, is there somebody that they can kind of connect with where that feels appropriate, it feels supportive, but it doesn't feel overwhelming to that peer at the same time? So those are kind of some suggestions of what you can do. And it's really hard because they're not very concrete things, but it is about having the conversation and having that understanding of what's happened to that person. So that's really key. So And I've already kind of really been highlighting and sort of emphasizing the need to allow conversation and connection. So, connection provides an opportunity for the young person to feel heard and understood. Now, if we think about this, if you've lost somebody in your family, how hard is it sometimes to talk to your family members if you know that they're really upset? If you're a young person, particularly, you might not want to upset your parent anymore by saying how sad you are because they might seem to have it more together than you, or, whatever the circumstances. So, allowing somebody to have a space to connect and talk about it can be really, really helpful. And it might be that you're the trusted person, so that person might feel comfortable coming to talk to you, but it might be a peer, it might be anybody around them in your school setting. So being really mindful if that's really important. So offer a gentle opportunity to talk, listen and show empathy to how they're feeling, reassure and validate their experience. Don't rush to fix things. It's okay not to have the answers, but giving that space to feel sad or angry or letting them have that emotion in whatever way, you don't have to fix it. And young people I've talked about have sort of always said it's not about you fixing it, it's just having a space and feeling like I can say what I need to say. So respect that space when it's needed and provide the young person with various means of expression. So, some people might be really vocal and might talk to you quite openly about it, but some people might find that really hard to put into words how they're feeling, especially if you're sort of thinking about the younger group. So it might be that, you use artwork, you might use journaling for teenagers maybe, or older sort of young people. So just give them different means of being able to express themselves and sort of normalizing those feelings and saying it's okay. It's okay to kind of talk about those feelings inside, they're natural experiences. So it's a really good idea to do that. Um, I found sort of personally that conversations are really critical. Now, I sort of talked a bit about my child earlier. My child was 4 when I lost my sister-in-law who gave birth, which is a really traumatic story, which I won't tell you the full details, but my daughter was 4 years old, and what she saw was her cousins losing their mum, and a lot of change that happened in terms of ripple effects. But what that meant was my 4-year-old would say to me, Mummy, are you going to go to heaven as well? Which is the toughest question you can possibly have as a parent to answer, really, isn't it? Well, that's my feeling. You might not share that feeling. But that's a really, really tough question because what you can't say is, no, that won't happen because we don't know what's going to happen. So you can't sort of say that it won't, but equally you have to acknowledge how they feel in that moment. So my 4-year-old was sharing her anxieties by asking me that question. And so what we did is we had a conversation about it, but I didn't kind of sort of lie. I didn't make up any metaphors or anything. I just kept it really straight with a lot of compassion, with a lot of empathy for how she was feeling. And, and that's all you can do sometimes. So I wanted to share that just because it's helpful to sort of think about those conversations can be really tough to have. So don't be afraid to have them though. Um, yeah. So, but like I say, just remember that those conversations might change over time and their needs might change as well over time. But just validate their worries and upsets and don't lie to them about what's the truth and what's not the truth, really, generally. Okay. So, in terms of sort of next steps, I guess what you could think about is inform people who need to know. We don't have to tell everybody, but think about who needs to know this information. I guess if this young person is in classrooms where, they might struggle and the teacher that leads that classroom doesn't know about it, that can make it really difficult and confusing, doesn't it, for the teacher, but it also makes it more challenging for the young person. So really have a think about who needs to know this information to enable support for that young person to be in place. And maybe also encourage the young person to think about activities they enjoy, but be really mindful at the same time of emotions that could create for that young person, that sort of sense of guilt if they have a really nice time. So if, playing football is their favorite thing and you go and kick a ball about with them and they have a really lovely time, that's great for them. But at the same time, they might have that sense of guilt of having a nice time when they feel they shouldn't. So just kind of be mindful of those kind of mixed emotions. And it kind of brings us back a little bit to that tangled ball that Zoe talked about. And it can feel really messy because you can have that mix of feelings all at the same time. So maybe they need a bit of support in saying goodbye. So think about, did this young person attend the funeral? Were they able to have a way of saying goodbye? Is there a way that they can be enabled to sort of mark the person or say goodbye? So with my young children, when my granny died, one of the things we did is we planted a rose because I didn't think taking them to the funeral was the right thing to do at the time. And we planted a rose in the garden, and my granny had this lovely tea set and tray, and we took it in the garden, and we had this lovely kind of biscuits and tea in the garden while planting this plant. And it was a way of marking the loss of granny, basically, or great granny to them. So it's thinking about, can you do something that enables a way of marking the person or acknowledging the person, or maybe saying goodbye to the person, whatever that need might be, really. I feel like I've done lots of oversharing this morning, but hey ho. So maybe also one of the challenges can be is what to say when peers talk about it or ask them about it. That can feel incredibly awkward, can't it? So especially if, as the young person who's had the loss, they don't want to talk about it, maybe, or maybe they do want to talk about it. But it might be that you help them think about a response to when peers are asking them when it feels too much. And it might be that you help them give them a prompt of an answer like, please don't ask me for more information. I can't talk about it right now. Or it might be, thanks for asking, but it's really tricky for me to talk about it right now. So empowering them to find an answer when that might be really difficult for them. Okay. So I'm going to move us on to thinking about the importance of language. So be curious about what language the child or the family are using to talk about death. This can be well quirky in my experience. I've talked about flowers and heaven, the works in my experiences. So it is working with whatever they bring and whatever they think about it, rather than necessarily giving them your language and your beliefs. Unless they really struggle to find a meaning and a way to think about it. It's important to think about using simple language, avoid euphemisms such as lost or gone to sleep. They haven't gone to sleep at the end of the day, but we think we're being really kind about it. But I guess it kind of fosters the idea that maybe they'll come back when they wake up. Be really clear, be really honest and age appropriate. So a bit like I was talking about earlier, I couldn't say to my daughter, I won't die. So, because that wouldn't have been honest, I wouldn't know. And I just said, hopefully I won't, but I couldn't say I wouldn't. Um, be led by the child's understanding. So think about, how do they make sense? Expect questions and prepare how you may kind of answer some of those. That can be really, really hard because you might sort of expect certain questions and some might totally throw you. you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not sure. Can I go away and think about it and come back to you? Because you're showing them you care enough to give the right answer. So, yeah, so just kind of have a bit of a think, look, that's the next point, and I've forgotten it was the next point. So it's okay to come back. But if you've got an answer, that's brilliant. The young person doesn't have the answer if they're asking you necessarily either. So it's okay if you don't either. A lot of the time, people worry about what if I say the wrong thing? I'd be rich for the amount of times I've heard that question, if I'm honest, because that is one question that teachers, parents, family members, friends, they'll often say, what if I say the wrong thing to the person that's lost somebody? Trust me, I've worried about it myself, really worrying about, do I ask my niece and nephew about how they're feeling? I feel that question every time I see them. Do we still talk about her? Do we not talk about her? You're a human being, so it's okay not to have all the answers. It's enough to listen and validate their experience. Be led by them. And if you get it wrong and you feel you've got it wrong, have a conversation about it. That's okay. Always good modeling anyway to say, not sure I've got that right. So there are some activities we can do with young people. We can think about, so when a child wants to talk about it but finds it challenging, activities can be really, really helpful and might feel a bit more comfortable, might feel more comfortable to you, might also feel more comfortable to them. So there's lots and lots of different ideas, and we've just named a few here. And sometimes it's about capturing memories. One of the biggest fears sometimes is about forgetting the person or forgetting something that's really important to us about the person that we've lost. And you might resonate with some of this too. And it's like, how do we not lose track of that person? And it might be that we do a memory jar, we might do memory trees, we might do photo books or memory stones or artwork. It's a whole load of different ways of doing this. Or you might do some storytelling. Stories can help young people particularly understand grief and their feelings. Now, it's interesting. I saw a young person who was neurodiverse a really long time ago now, but he's really stuck with me because um, I was asked to do some grief work with him, and he was really stuck. He felt incredibly stuck, and he'd lost a grandparent. And what we did was we did a memory book. So, and he came up with all the different things he really liked about his grandparent and all the things that meant something to him. And we would draw them out, we would write them out, whatever kind of worked for him at the time. And one of the things that came out of it was that this young person had been really categorical about people's roles in his world. And this grandparent had had a specific role, but he couldn't just fill that role. So he was really missing that role that that person sort of filled, really. So we were then able to, once we sort of did this memory book and worked this out together, think about how can we sort of fill a little bit of that void, but without losing the kind of importance of that person. So sometimes it can be helpful to help us understand something, but it's also a lovely way of commemorating and remembering that person. So there's lots of free resources online from sort of charities like Winston's Wish and Elsa Resources, which we've got a link to below. But there's also some lovely books. And the sort of books are Invisible String, which is a picture book where a parent shares how they are all connected with an invisible string made of love. And it helps with the separation, anxiety, grief, and loss by highlighting our unbreakable emotional connection with one another. So these are some books that we've just put in here, maybe for you to check out if you want to. Or The Hair-Shaped Hole, which is gently explores themes of loss and grief by looking at the emotions felt after losing a friend and how remembering and creating memories of that person can fill the void of grief. Now, we're not saying we're going to take it away, but it's just about filling a little bit of that big hole because it can feel like a humongous hole for us sometimes. Okay, so what we'd like you to do is just have a little think about what activities or resources have you found helpful in supporting children with bereavement. It's okay to say if you haven't. So are there sort of some things that you found particularly helpful? Memory scrapbook, yeah, lovely. It's a little bit like that, what we did with that young person I was telling you about. Okay, so maybe memory scrapbook. It can be really hard to know what else to do sometimes. So hopefully some of the resources and ideas we shared and the links we shared might be really helpful for you to think about. Giving the time to just be with them, absolutely lovely. Love the invisible string as it works for all types of grief, including parents going away for work. Definitely lovely. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really nice reflection. So yeah, it doesn't have to be because you've lost somebody physically. It can also be used for other kind of losses that, Zoe talked about at the beginning. So how do we support people going through those transitions and those changes as well? So lovely. Thank you for the sharing. Okay. Now we want to sort of think about what we always sort of think about is when you're supporting young people, whether that's your own children or as a teacher, it's really important to look after your well-being as well. So, we can't support somebody if our glass is empty. So, so if our fuel tank's empty, we cannot kind of be going anywhere. If I've not got my diesel in my car, I can't get to work. So we've kind of got to look after ourselves to enable us to look after other people. And that's a really, really key message. So now this is a topic that can be so difficult for us to discuss for a variety of reasons. The young person you're working with might trigger like a memory or an experience for yourself because, we most of us have had some sense of loss or change or bereavement and various different experiences. It's important that you look after your own well-being, therefore. So continue to do activities you enjoy. Make sure you have enough self-care for yourself, so mindfulness or journaling, whatever you find helpful, and some self-compassion. So if you're really struggling to support that young person, give yourself some self-compassion. It's okay. And maybe seek some support from other people around you. So seek support from friends and services, maybe, but also your colleagues, maybe. So be aware of your own boundaries. How far are you comfortable talking about this topic? How comfortable are you about supporting a young person where maybe that really resonates for you? Sometimes that can be helpful, but sometimes that can be harder. So really think about where you're at when you're supporting this young person that you may be holding in mind or that you may be facing who's had a significant loss, but also hold yourself in mind. Don't go 100 miles an hour just because you feel you have to. It's look after yourselves as well. And we say that to parents all the time in various different contexts. So this is no different. You are human beings that also need to have some care for yourselves. So, okay. So signposting young people and families. So these are just a few suggestions of different things that can be sort of suggested. So obviously there's the emotional literacy support assistance. There's a member of staff the young person maybe feels comfortable with. So it might be that, in your school there's a particular staff member or a particular kind of person that person feels more comfortable coming into and enables them to come into school and manage a little bit of the day, or your school nursing team, or the wellbeing team, school's wellbeing team I could put my tongue back in, designated safeguarding lead. Or outside of school, you might be sort of thinking about different resources like Winston's Wish, Cruise, Bereavement Support, Nikki's Way. There's also Bereavement UK. That's a great website I found for a lot of information. It might be that you need some NHS support. Or Grief Encounters info for parents supporting children. So there's lots of different resources out there. So maybe kind of think about putting together a bit of a pack that might be really helpful for when you need it. Okay. So now just sort of thinking about how confident do you feel sort of after sort of our presentation in supporting a young person with a bereavement? And it's fine if that's changed or not changed for you. Okay, yeah, great. So somebody feels a little bit more confident. Okay, fabulous. Okay, I think we've had the responses there, haven't we?
It's just like what
Okay.
shows up as the Q&A, I think, maybe.
Oh, is that what it shows up as the Q&A? Yeah, okay, no worries. Okay, um, so I guess this now leads us to the point of questions and answers. Now, I know we've got a really small group, so you can do it either way, whatever way feels most comfortable to you. Zoe and I are the only ones that can see the Q&A questions that come in, so we can respond to it really anonymously. We won't name names if that's helpful, if that makes you feel more comfortable.